Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning journalist, Joel Waldman.
Webster, I had the privilege of driving by your office and actually put it out on Instagram. You've got a sign out there that says, Justice for Dan. This for you is so much more than just a trial. For those who don't know you, I know you had some personal things happen in your life that affected you, that made you become inclined to become an attorney, but then also your relationship with Dan. Just speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, so I had a friend who was charged with a crime. I used to pour concrete for a living. I had a friend who was charged with a crime he didn't commit, and I was going back to school at night, and he was a really good kid, and it was just gross what the prosecutors did to him, and it languished for about 2 years. Took my last night class on a Thursday night. They were picking his jury on a Friday morning. Didn't have a cell phone. Got off work around 3. Called and found out that the judge had dismissed his case. I know now how that played out. They clearly filed a motion to dismiss, and they squeezed him right until the very end to see if he would take a plea, and he wouldn't. Anyway, that night I went to his celebration party, and his public defenders were younger than me. And they came over to give me a hug, and I said, I'm applying to law school. And he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, if I could do for one person what those people did for you, then it'd be a life worth living. He said, well, good luck. So went to FSU a little bit later in life, and started in 2002 and at FSU Law School. And I can tell your viewers, this is important for me. When I was in law school, by the time I came to law school, all the lawyer jokes had been told 1,000 times. And it was clear to me that law schools were making a very concerted effort to stress professionalism and ethics. And so I worked at the state attorney's office a couple of years, went to work for a white collar criminal defense attorney that Tim has worked with many, many times over the years. Then I went to work for a guy who had kind of a general practice, and was a brilliant man, and worked with him for quite a few years, but he had no life. I mean, Sundays, he'd call me at 2 a.m. on a Sunday with work questions, and Tim knows who I'm talking about. Fantastic lawyer, brilliant man, but my wife finally gave me an ultimatum. She was like, it's the job or it's the job. And I was like, okay, the job is gone, and started my own firm, and was, like probably most small businesses when they first started, was pretty scared. And a friend of mine called me, it wasn't long after I had my firm going, and said that he had a case for me. And I'd done some pro bono family law stuff. I actually tried a pro bono family law case against Linda Bailey one time. I won. But I didn't, I had no real inclination to do family law, litigation. I know Tim probably would back me up on this. I'm sure John probably would. It's kind of a zero-sum game. And it's, you kind of have to, you can't pull any punches. You have to kind of go for the gusto. And when children are involved, I just didn't like the prospect of kind of fighting like that when children were involved. So I kind of shied away from really taking on any family law cases. And I worked with my father-in-law, and he was kind enough to let me do his pro bono family law cases when they came in, when the Tallahassee Bar Association sent them to him. He was kind enough to let me do those, which was how I went up against Miss Bailey. But so my friend called me and told me that he had a case that he thought I would kind of be the perfect person for. And I think he knew, me representing a law professor would offer probably real esteem to my fledgling firm. So, I told him, well, Tor, I don't do family law. And he said, you don't have to worry about it. He's a law professor. He'll teach you everything you need to know. I said, well, that's probably a good thing. So I said, well, I'll meet with him. And so I read all of the pleadings. We were going to have coffee on Tennessee Street. And I decided I was not going to take the case. It seemed to me as if the litigants were drafting the papers more so than the lawyers. I don't want to practice that way. Two, the idea of representing a law professor who was accused of contempt and was pointing the finger back in the other direction was not a prospect that was very appealing to me. I quote my fees on how much I'm going to stress over your case. That's literally how I quote fees. And the idea of seeing a law professor possibly get disbarred and almost certainly face the prospect of losing his job as a law professor, given the stress on ethics that law schools have, and we're hammering all of the students. If all of a sudden their law professors are held in contempt or dinged for submitting fraudulent pleadings, I was like, that's just not something I want to be affiliated with. But I went to meet with him anyway because I told him I would, and I just really liked him. I walked in immediately. He wasn't anything like I thought he was going to be. He was very approachable, down to earth, had a good sense of humor. And we sat there for quite a few hours and probably spent half the time just talking like humans, not about law. And he convinced me that he was on the right side of history and that he was going to be able to establish that Wendi had indeed concealed assets and committed fraud. And then kind of given, for me, what moved me was his main concern was what he believed was the alienation of his children. And when I heard that, and I knew it wasn't about money, that was a big game changer for me too, because going in there just to fight for money with children in the mix and all that, I mean, it's just kind of just unpalatable to me. But if you're fighting because you feel like people on the other side are hurting your children or trying to estrange you from your children, which is what Danny was fighting for. He was fighting for children, not money. And Wendi was the exact opposite. They wanted money, period. I said, you know what? This is a fight I can get behind. And so I decided I was going to work with him. And we had to, it was my strategy that we needed to send requests for admissions to Wendi. He had absolute dead bang proof that she had committed fraud in her financial disclosures. And I was like, look, we're going to give her a chance to either come clean. Well, I'm going to ask her to admit you committed fraud. And if she denies it, she'll just be guilty of committing a second act of fraud. And that was kind of my strategy with him. But I told him, I said, look, man, if I file this, even if she zigs or zags, it doesn't really matter at that point, because one way or the other, she's going to be on the hook for fraud. And it could have real dire consequences on her ability to practice law and to work, and on your children. And if we have to do it, we have to do it. But I really feel like I owe it to your children to at least go try to talk to her lawyer. If we can't figure out some way to resolve this short of full on, conflagration. And met with her lawyer. And he's a very, very, very reputable lawyer here in town. Been around a long, long time, tried a bunch of cases. And I'd worked with him on some white collar stuff in the past, so I knew him. And he kind of poo-pooed what I was saying. And I just finally told him, I said, hey, look, Jimmy, my conscience is clear. And Tim's laughing. He knows.
I know Jimmy.
And he's a great lawyer. And Jimmy's kind of got a shtick. He can kind of all shucks you. And like, Steve, oh, man, I don't know what. Oh, I think you're just going a little bit overboard here, kind of like that or whatever. And I know Jimmy, and that's kind of a routine that he has, but that's not really, he's a very bright man. And when you're kind of in normal mode. And I said, look, my conscience is clear. I did what I came here to do. If we, can find some old school resolution for this, I feel like we owe it to our clients to try. And if we can't, then so be it. That's the only time in my career as a lawyer that I've ever gone to another lawyer's office and tried to broker a deal. For me, it could be perceived as a sign of weakness. And so it's not something I would normally ever entertain. But I felt so strongly about the fact that if this went forward with this litigation, that it was going to be so damaging to Wendi, that I just had no choice but to take the risk of looking weak. And so I turned around and was walking out of his office, and I reached down and grabbed his doorknob, and I could still see it in my mind's eye. And he said, Stephen, I know what you're trying to do. And it was like, for the first time, he wasn't all shucks at me. He said, Stephen, I know what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it. And I turned around, looked back at him, and I said, well, Jimmy, if I feel like I owe it to your client to at least give her this chance to see if we can't find common ground. I said, but if I haven't heard from her or you on July 18th, I'm going to file something. And when I file it, I feel like there's going to be no going back. And he said, I understand. And I never heard back from them. And that was on June 24th. And July 18th was a Friday. And so I told Danny, that was our deadline, and told Jimmy that was when I was going to file it. I didn't tell him what I was going to file, but I just told him. And Thursday night, my wife and I and our kids, we were traveling to a baseball tournament in South Haven, Mississippi, up by Memphis. And so I drafted the request for admissions on Thursday, kind of went over them with Dan Thursday night. And the plan was we were going to talk the next morning to finalize them for filing. And I had told Dan that I was convinced that he was still seeing Wendi intermittently. And I told him, I said, that's got to stop. If I find out you're hanging around her, I'm going to be out. I'm going to get off this case, because I had genuine concerns that she might accuse him of like hitting her, kicking her, slapping her, try to get an injunction against him, and then use that as a tactical advantage to try to leverage her move with the children back down to Miami. And I know the lawyers here know that they've seen those family law cases that trickle over into criminal court. And so Friday morning, he called me. I was in the central time zone. We had stopped in Hoover, Alabama. And it was 8 a.m. my time. My children were jumping on the beds. I was like, I can't do this right now, Dan. I'll call you back. Let me get the children fed and get on the road, and I'll call you back at 11 my time. And as we were driving down the highway, and I was just about to call him, my wife decided that she needed to make a stop at a mall. And so I
imagine that.
Totally random. So I Googled, and I found there was a nice mall about 15 minutes away. And I said, well, actually, that's perfect, because you can take the kids inside, and I'll get on the phone with Dan and stay in the truck, and I'll have privacy, and we'll go over these and get them filed, because they were ready pretty much to be filed. And, kind of going back to the duty to keep your client informed, I wanted to make sure he had a chance to look at them, and he was satisfied. So I called him. I believe it was at, it would have been 12:18 Tallahassee time, Eastern. So I guess he had probably been shot about, 25 minutes prior, and maybe 30. He didn't answer, which I thought was really weird, because Dan would always answer my calls. We talked a lot, and even if he was with the children, he would still answer my call. He would say, I'm with the boys, I'll call you back, and hang up. So I thought it was weird, and I hadn't heard from him, and it was probably 3:30 or so Tallahassee time, or 2:33. And I was starting to actually get frustrated, because I was starting to think that he was getting cold feet about filing. And I'd already told the lawyer it was going to happen. So I was starting to get a little bit frustrated with Dan, thinking that probably Wendi had called him and kind of beguiled him or whatever, or cajoled him or whatever, manipulated him. And my phone rang, and it was a police officer here in town that I've worked with in the past. I know. And it's not unusual for some of my former clients just to call me on random things. And so I answered, and I said, hey, what's going on? And she said, how do you know Dan Markel? And I said, what? And she said, how do you know Dan Markel? And I was like, what in the world is happening right now? And then it dawned on me that she was in violent crimes. And so I concluded that Wendi had accused Dan of battery or something like that. And that's where my mind went. So I went into lawyer mode, and I said, he's my client. I'm going to talk to him right now. And she said, you can't. And I said, I can, which isn't necessarily 100% true, but I said, yes, I can. I represent him right now. I have an active case, active representation. I want to talk to my client right now. And that part was true, but it was a different case. So she doesn't necessarily have to, I don't represent him on that one. Anyway, she responded, and she said, you can't, because something really bad has happened. And I know it sounds crazy, But at that very moment, I knew they had murdered him. I knew they killed him. And never once had that crossed my mind before. But just something came over me. And so that was kind of my backstory and how this 11-year+ year odyssey started for me.
Wow.